Oh, hello, and welcome to the Sunday live streaming edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk about the spirit of 78. And I'm not talking about a particular year, I'm talking about the 78 record, the old fashioned shellac disc, the ones that came in actual albums with pages, and the record would stick out of these little pages, hence the name albums, a name that happens to have stuck. Now, why am I talking about this obsolete format, this format that didn't sound all that great and was so brittle? Well, it's less about the format itself, it's less about the records, it's about the artists that were alive and recording at the time when the 78 record, the shellac direct to disc recording, and all its comparative primitiveness was the standard. And this is why I think it's important, particularly for European classical music. So, as I've said in many videos, including some recent ones, so you can use the little thingamajig in YouTube to find them, the 19th century was the golden age of European classical music in terms of composition, and for the purposes of this discussion, probably more importantly, performance. Performance reached a standard of grandeur, of professionalism, and frankly, of downright beauty that was hitherto unmatched. Now, what does this have to do with the 78 recording and frankly other forms of recording like the Edison cylinder, that really bad sounding thing, but which kicked off the whole age of recorded sound? Well, the reason that it's important is that centuries, like all delineations of time and space, are random. It's not as though the year switches from 1899 to 1900 and we say, right, it's the 20th century, guys. We've got to do things differently. I'm sure some people think that. And with the TikTok generation here, I'm sure that a lot of people that have minds that are more mechanical than creative might think that, especially. But no, time is a continuum, and the way that we measure it is a random and artificial construct. Now, what this means is that the great artists from this golden age, they didn't all just go away, into Hades in the year 1900. They were around and they were living, and many of them lived to be quite old. Many of them who might have been relatively young in the late 19th century lived well into the 20th century. And this meant that many of these golden era artists recorded music, where we normally think of the 19th century as the pre-recorded music era. It's not entirely true. Music recording came out in the last couple of decades of the 19th century, but more importantly, many of these people lived into the age of electronic amplified recording, which came out in the middle of the 1920s. And this means that we do, as the human race, have a treasure trove of recordings from people that represent they represent the authentic sound of that most important era of European classical music. I'm just going to name some artists that recorded either entirely or mostly in the era before magnetic tape ushered in the high fidelity age, the age in which we are comfortable listening to things because it sounds good. It sounds at minimum acceptable, but most of it sounds good. Between the 1950s and the present day, all professional recordings sound pretty good because the standards of magnetic tape were established fairly early on. And whether listening on a tape yourself or an LP or a CD, yes, we debate between the comparative merits of all these formats, but the gap between the tape, the LP, and the CD, and even the high resolution digital formats of today, that gap is maybe like, ugh. And the gap between the era of the 78 shellac disc recording and the magnetic tape high fidelity recording is like, no. And so we see just how big that gap is, in which we are now going to plunge headlong. So he's some of the historic artists. So let's Siegfried Wagner, the son of Richard Wagner. He was obviously a great maestro himself. He ran the family business, and he recorded a lot of his father's music. That is such an interesting and deep connection to that 19th century golden era. Even the great early 20th century conductors, many of them had, and all of these conductors were born in the 19th century. They are part of that oral tradition passed down between Beethoven, Wagner, Wagner and that generation from the late 19th century. People like Furtwängler, yes, he lived into the hi-fi age, but arguably his best recordings were before the hi-fi age. Wilhelm Mengelberg, another great conductor, one of my two favorites. Most of his stuff, virtually all of it, was pre-hi-fi. I mean, tape was invented in the 1930s in Germany, but it wasn't totally widespread. So I think we can definitely put Mengelberg on that list. Who else can we put on that list? Arthur Nikesh, one of the great 19th century conductors, the sort of the leader of Berlin before Furtwängler. And he was someone who, in the early age of acoustic recording, so this is really primitive recording, he recorded excerpts of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And we have that recorded. The recording quality isn't the best, but we have this great man of conducting, one of the, some call him the best of all time. And we have at least a little bit of music of his. Richard Strauss, he recorded all of his own compositions, well, all of his symphonic poems, certainly, some of them several times in this pre-hi-fi age. Having that great composer, a composer for the ages, conducting his own music, that itself a total treasure trove. The Romanian composer Ionescu Scriabin didn't record, but he did create piano rolls for player pianos. Just thought I would throw that in. Who else do I have on this incredibly exciting list? Max von Schillings. He knew Bruckner. He knew Brahms. He knew all of these people. He was a great late 19th, early 20th century composer himself. We have lots of his conducting. Max Fiedler, a man who conducted the premieres of several Brahms symphonies and was Brahms's favorite conductor. We have him recording Brahms and several other pieces in this pre-hi-fi age. The list goes on. Who else do I have here on this list? Eric Kleber, most of his stuff. Albert Coates, most of his stuff. Henry Wood, most of his stuff. Ravel and Debussy, composers performing their own music in this pre-hi-fi age. Saint-Saëns, another French composer. Most of the English composers, whether it's Holst or Elgar or Percy Grainger, who was a bit of everything and everywhere. The best stuff that, in my view, Stokowski did in his golden age in Philadelphia, that was all recorded in the pre-hi-fi age, dating back from the first decades of the 20th century right up to the late 1930s. Caruso, the most famous opera singer of the day. Morris Rosenthal, a great pianist. Ellie Ney, who, yes, lived into the hi-fi age, but most of her recordings were in the pre-hi-fi era. Edwin Fischer, one of the great pianists ever, most of his stuff in the pre-hi-fi age. Wilhelm Balkhaus, half of his career pre-hi-fi, half of his career in the golden age of stereo. Interesting contrast. Alfred Cortot, one of the most celebrated pianists of all time, everything in the pre-hi-fi age. Arthur de Graaf, a very famous pianist, pre-hi-fi age. Just going through the list a bit further, just to give you an idea of just how rich this tradition is. On violin, we have the great Huberman, Karl Fleisch, Arnold Rose, Joseph Joachim, Brahms's good friend, some say the best violinist ever, Eugene Yasset. I don't pronounce that perfectly, but you get the idea. A lot of the Kreisler stuff, Fritz Kreisler, very famous violinist, Alfred Busch, another famous one, Pablo de Sarasate, one of the most famous violinists, pre-hi-fi. Joseph Szigeti, pre-hi-fi, in most of these cases. Emanuel Furman, most of these, his cello recordings, pre-hi-fi, and so many other conductors. Early Bruno Walter, before he became an old man, his youth in the pre-hi-fi age, and he recorded in it. Same with Klemperer. Even Karl Berman Karajan, their very, very earliest stuff was in the pre-hi-fi age, as was Knappertz, Busch, Abendroth, great conductors I've talked about many, many times. And the list could go on. This is just a fraction of some of the great people. Did I mention Elgar? I think maybe I did. He recorded almost everything that he did that he composed, Leopold Auer, another great violinist, Penderecki, a great pianist, Felix Weingartner, a great conductor, all in the pre-hi-fi age. Edvard Grieg recorded some of his own music. The list goes on. Some even claim, and we've never found it, that even Tchaikovsky recorded some of his music at the end of his life, although we haven't, as a society, been able to find it. And it could just be a rumor. So what's the point of all this? What's the point of me just listing all of these great names? Well, there's a tragic element to this because not a lot of these recordings are listened to, and there's a perfectly logical reason why, and it's not a new reason either. When magnetic tape and high fidelity became invented, first with tape in the 30s, but only in Germany. Then it came to America and the rest of the world in the late 40s, and we get the magnetic tape and the long playing record. And by the 1950s, the E78 shellac disc becomes an obsolete relic of the past because we now have ways to record and listen to music that are so, like I said, the big gap, so very sonically superior. And this meant that people not wanting to listen to music with poor audio fidelity, however great the performances, were opting for the new formats. And so all of these great recordings became lost almost instantly. Now, some of them, yes, were remastered for tape or LP, but very few comparatively. And the same goes for CD. In the early days of CD, no one would have been interested in this because, much like the LP when it came out, or the reel to reel quarter-inch tape when it was being sold for consumer purposes beginning in the 50s, these are hi fi formats. So you're not going to play an ancient, low fidelity recording to show off the new shiny compact disc. Though by the late 90s, when it became increasingly inexpensive, to create a compact disc, a lot of this stuff did get reissued, albeit not very popular. It was sort of for people who were in the know. Now, though, with the age of not needing physical formats, you are seeing a lot of this stuff very widespread. Most of the great names that I mentioned will have some, or in many cases, all of their recordings on Spotify or available to download at a comparatively popular price on various specialty websites. And so, in this sense, the age of digital has been a godsend because these recordings can now be preserved in the cloud and they can be accessible, something that they weren't in the age of the tape and LP and much of the age of the CD. Now, again, why were they inaccessible? Well, because when people stopped listening to 78s, they stopped producing 78 playback equipment. They ran at a different speed. It was a 10-inch disc rather than 12 or 45. Totally different cartridge, and people just didn't bother. Yes, there were always some ultra specialty people that could make the cartridges, etc. But no one bothered with 78s. They were the kind of thing where there were record stores where you would have the modern records or even the vintage records, and then maybe they'd have a back room where in a disorganized pile you'd have scratched up poor condition 78s that they might sell for $1, and a lot of those would get nailed on the wall of a coffee shop at some point because no one knew what the hell they were. But what they are, in spite of their low fidelity, these are treasures. These are archival treasures, and not just of the classical music world. I happen to mention it, but early pop musicians, a lot of stride piano, a lot of early jazz, early blues, early ragtime. I've interviewed a great ragtime historian, a guy in California named Foundering, and he is at the moment recording all of these lost ragtime songs, the first pop musical genre. It was the genre that built the bridge between pop and folk music. It was the first commercially viable and successful genre of popular music. It was the very first. So they had all of those recordings. And it's really, when people talk about authenticity, you can't get much more authentic than having originals play their own compositions or perform the compositions of the people who were their teachers or their collaborators, or their friends. I mean, this is an early 20th century window into the authentic style of music of the 19th century. And yes, the fidelity might be bad, but The absolute beauty of these recordings is great. And we've got a comment. Benjamin Manning Music writes, I've got a music hall comedy theater box set of 78s that were amazing, and still are, but I haven't had a 78 turntable for years. Would love them all cleaned up by AI. Well, thanks, Benjamin, because that actually is a great segue into what the next part of the show was. Now, cleaning music up. Now, remastering and remixing are two very different things. When you remaster, it simply means to present the authentic master source in the best way possible, whether it's through better EQing, leveling it out, etc. Remixing, in the modern sense, means going back to the stems, the multi-tracks that didn't exist in the 78 day, and rearranging how the music sounds. Now, with AI, those two things can become a bit blurred because good musical AI can identify very specific sonic elements of any recording and do what you want with them. It can bend the notes, change the pitches, it could make Enrico Caruso sound like Mickey Mouse, but that isn't what we'd want to do. Now, even before AI, digital tools in modern digital workstations have existed to clean up these recordings, not through a complete remixing, but through a remastering. They can do things like remove some of the hiss, remove some of the background surface noise. And that probably, again, is why more people are listening to these recordings on your Spotify's and Modify's, because while a lot of them are still, obviously low fidelity, a lot of them have been cleaned up. But with AI, the possibilities are huge. You could theoretically, using existing AI software, go back to a cylindrical Edison recording of the great violinist Joseph Joachim and make it sound, dare I say, almost high fidelity. A lot of people would say that that would take away from the authenticity because too many of the sonic elements would have to be reprocessed. But I would say that the most ethical way to do it is do a version that's super cleaned up, do a version that's maybe minimally cleaned up, which is what we already have, and then just do a flat, straight transfer from the best condition original disc to the digital format for archival purposes and throw it all on Spotify. It's all in the cloud anyway. We don't have to worry about the constraints of physical discs. And I think that this would be an amazing project. Now, many people have digitized, even on their own, in their own time and on their own dime, they've digitized their own 78 collections. And it's all perfectly legal because most of this stuff is well beyond the scope of copyright. Some of it is, that's your legal warning. Not that anyone really is enforcing this stuff. It's not like Taylor Swift bootlegging. But most of this stuff is in the public domain anyway. So you wouldn't need to pay anyone or else permission from anyone to do what you want with these sound recordings and then upload them wherever you want. And so this opens up the possibility. I would love it if some AI company that wanted to really show off how good their wares were, if they were to digitize using the best transfer equipment, as many as possible of these 78s in as many genres as possible, and use the technology to make it sound listenable to the modern ear, to make it sound kind of sort of hi-fi. It will never sound like an RCA living stereo 1950s or 60s magnetic tape, or a Decca for that matter, or a Mercury. It's never going to sound like your Super Audio CD recorded on DSD by a very good sound engineer in Japan, where they're still very much into this very high quality digital format. It's never going to sound like that. But if you made it sound more listenable or even more acceptable to the modern ear, I think that more people would be exposed to these great historic recordings. And I don't say historic in the sense that, oh, these are museum pieces. In the cases of many of these classical conductors and violinists and pianists and other performers that I mentioned, these are the definitive versions, in my view, of these pieces. They have never been recorded better since in terms of performance. In terms of sound quality, you could, go to a youth orchestra, hold up your iPhone, and get something that sounds better in terms of the acoustical properties. But in terms of the performance, We are talking about the founders of genres. We are talking about the golden acolytes of the golden age of these particular genres. We're talking about composers in both pop music, in classical, jazz, blues, ragtime, stride, boogie woogie, so many different kinds of music, music hall, vaudeville, and these were the original people. And you cannot beat an original. But a lot of people are willing to settle for less because they'd rather hear a mediocre performer recorded with modern high fidelity sound than go back to the 78. So I think AI could serve a huge purpose because the discs themselves, they're, so even though they crack easily, they're surprisingly durable. And so all of these discs are around. Many of them have already been digitized. I mean, the Internet Archive itself has decent digitizations of many, but to clean these up with AI, I think could be an absolute game changer, not only for archival purposes, but for introducing this music to new audiences. Because when people hear the surface noise and the crackling, they go, eek. They don't want to hear it. And I admit, as someone who loves and has studied and knows all about high quality sound, from how it's recorded to the best way to reproduce it, to arguments over is MoFi right for having a DSD intermediary? Is half speed mastering of an LP the best way to go? These are arguments which are very important in the world of audiophiles and that type of thing. But in the scheme of pre hi-fi versus post hi-fi, like I said, versus the gap is much bigger when we're talking about anything before the 1950s versus everything from the 1950s to the present day. And AI may have the solution for this. So there was a Chinese AI company that actually used its technology to try to compose final movements to Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. Did we really need that? Not really. You can't really replace Schubert, but it was an interesting experiment. But I think this would actually be a much more useful application of AI to take music that already exists, these great recordings from these great musicians, and to turn them into something that doesn't offend the ears of people who have grown up, as everyone who's under the age of 100 has, in the age of modern high fidelity recordings, whether analog or digital. So that's my 2 cents on this issue. As always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.